despite the geographical isolation and cultural distinctiveness of Native American tribes. From the Western world, many of their customs and views on relationships had intriguing similarities to other societies. However, these customs also carried unique twists rooted in the social, spiritual, and environmental contexts of each tribe. For some Native American societies, intimate relationships were closely intertwined with religious beliefs, while for others, they were governed by communal duties or practical considerations. Through the rituals and traditions that governed relationships, we gain a glimpse of the importance of intimacy. As more than a personal bond, it was often an expression of tribal identity, a path to spiritual well-being, or even a communal asset. Cultural perspectives on intimacy and marital relations. Among various Native American tribes, relationships between men and women were seen through distinct cultural lenses. For some, relationships were highly regulated by taboos and prohibitions, while others placed fewer restrictions, emphasizing personal choice and communal bonds. The Apache, for example, held strong beliefs about the timing of intimate interactions, particularly during the agave harvest. They believed that intimacy during this period would negatively affect the fruit, rendering it tasteless and inedible. This practice demonstrates how Native American communities often linked everyday tasks with broader spiritual beliefs. In contrast to the Apache, the Comanche embraced a different view, especially concerning intimacy before important events, like battles or journeys. Rather than avoiding physical closeness, to conserve strength, they leaned into it, spending days with their partners to build morale. This reveals an intriguing view of intimacy, not only as a personal experience, but as a source of emotional strength. For the Comanche, the act of being close to a loved one reinforced their bravery and commitment as warriors, blending the personal and the communal in a unique way. The variations among tribes were vast. While some viewed intimacy primarily as a means to conceive children, others saw it as a way for men to achieve satisfaction, without necessarily considering the desires of women. For many, this distinction in perspective underscored a fundamental gender imbalance, reflecting the power dynamics and societal expectations within each community. This aspect sheds light on how gender roles influence not only day-to-day life, but also the intimate connections between individuals. The role of spiritual and ritual significance in intimacy. For some tribes, intimacy and relationships were steeped in ritual significance. The Mandan, for instance, practiced a ritual known as inviting the buffalo, where young women wrapped only in animal skins would bring food to the elder's tent as part of a ceremonial gathering. This event wasn't merely an act of hospitality, it held symbolic weight, honoring the continuity between the past and future generations after the elders had eaten. The younger women would escort them into the forest, where the elders engaged in rituals meant to ensure a successful hunting season. In this context, intimacy was more than a personal interaction. It was seen as a spiritual exercise, deeply connected to survival and prosperity. Interestingly, not all tribes held physical interactions as essential to these rituals. In cases where elders were physically unable to participate, they instead engaged in prayers for a prosperous hunt. This adaptation shows the flexibility of tribal customs, highlighting how spirituality and practical considerations often took precedence over physical actions. For tribes like the Mandan, intimacy with spiritual undertones reinforced a sense of unity between humans and nature, linking human reproduction with animal abundance. Another tribe with a unique approach to ritualized intimacy was the Ojibwe. In their community, shamans held powerful roles, sometimes manipulating spiritual beliefs for personal gain. In a troubling practice, shamans would forewarn certain women of a spiritual visit, claiming that a powerful spirit would inhabit another's body to engage with her. This warning often instilled fear and left the woman vulnerable to the shaman, who would later pose as the spirit. This custom reveals a darker side of tribal spiritual beliefs, where trust in religious figures could lead to exploitation. For the Ojibwe, the shaman's position was so revered that challenging his actions could be considered sacrilegious, creating a complex social trap for the women involved. Punishments for violating intimacy norms. Among Native American tribes, violations related to intimate relationships were treated with severe repercussions, often tailored to reflect each tribe's values. Crimes like rape, for example, were viewed as the most serious offenses. In most tribes, the punishment for such acts could be as severe as death. However, due to the practicalities of life, in these small communities, victims or their families sometimes accepted compensation as a form of justice. While this may seem lenient by today's standards, it often involved considerable payment by tribal standards, suggesting that material compensation held significant weight in tribal law. Different tribes handled these transgressions in unique ways. The Apache allowed men to marry women who they had previously forced into intimacy, provided that both families consented. This system, though unsettling by contemporary perspectives, was a form of resolution intended to prevent future conflict between families. However, the Zuni approached violations with a starkly different approach. In cases of abuse, a public trial was held, where the victim announced the punishment for the accused. This public accountability was one way the Zuni tribe ensured justice, while involving the entire community in the healing process. The most peculiar customs around intimacy-related transgressions belonged to the Ojibwe tribe. The foreman or shaman himself would occasionally pose as a perpetrator, in cases where he had warned a woman of a spiritual encounter. This manipulation of spirituality and fear illustrates a challenging dynamic within the tribe, where revered figures could exploit their influence without retribution. This misuse of power, while disturbing, reveals a layer of complexity within the tribe's social structure that prioritized belief in the supernatural over individual autonomy. Traditions resembling prostitution or communal sexual norms. The concept of prostitution, as known in the Western world, did not exist among Native American tribes in a traditional sense. However, some customs may resemble it in certain aspects. For instance, women had the cultural freedom to offer themselves to visitors if they wished. This practice, though voluntary, granted women an unusual degree of autonomy over their bodies. Married women especially maintained this right, reflecting a balance of personal freedom within a framework of community respect. A similar practice existed among the Salish tribe, where women, both single and married, were sometimes assigned temporary partners by tribal elders. This duty was seen as a communal service, connecting visitors and the tribe in a unique way. In this case, intimacy was less about individual choice and more about fulfilling a cultural expectation, suggesting that for some tribes, personal autonomy in relationships was secondary to the tribe's broader needs. During festivals, the Papago tribe permitted young women to form temporary unions with partners of their choosing. Adorned with intricate body art and corn leaves, these women would engage in ceremonial dances, whereupon interested men could pursue a relationship for the festival's duration. If these unions bore children, they were fully accepted into the tribe, symbolizing the Papago's openness to flexible family structures. These unions, while brief, could sometimes transform into lasting marriages, blurring the line between temporary intimacy and lifelong commitment. Marital infidelity, cultural perceptions and punishments. Despite some relatively flexible norms regarding intimacy, many tribes strictly discouraged adultery, especially for women. In most tribes, husbands would pay a significant price to a woman's family before marriage, symbolizing an investment in her loyalty and fidelity. As a result, an unfaithful wife was seen as betraying her family as much as her husband. In some tribes, such as the Comanche, a woman caught in an affair could face extreme punishment, including exile, servitude, or even being left in the forest as prey for wild animals. This harsh treatment reveals the extent to which loyalty was intertwined with a woman's value in her community. However, infidelity among men could also incur consequences, although these were often less severe. In cases where a man was caught with another woman, his wife's response was sometimes vengeful, but remained within cultural boundaries. In the Shoshone tribe, for instance, women were known to confront rivals with public insults, even throwing mud as a sign of contempt. This public shaming served as both a punishment for the rival woman and a cathartic release for the wife. Yet, if a wife's rage extended to violence, and she killed her unfaithful husband, her actions were generally met with community disapproval, effectively isolating her from any future support. In some tribes, women who suspected their husbands of infidelity would take bold actions to discourage rivals. Such confrontations, while dramatic, were sanctioned by the community as a way of preserving marital harmony without involving tribal leaders. Interestingly though, tribes like the Hopi allowed certain exceptions for men who could have a private wife, in addition to their legal spouse, reflecting a double standard within their social structure. The cultural impact of marriage as transactional bond. Marriage in many Native American tribes was less about romantic love, more about forming alliances and ensuring social stability. In some tribes, marriage was considered a transaction where the groom would offer gifts to his bride's family, symbolizing both his respect and his intentions. This tradition underscored the belief that a woman was an investment binding her husband to her family. In a way that transcended simple emotional attachment, this transactional approach often served to strengthen bonds between families, as disputes were resolved within the network created by marriage. For instance, in the Omaha tribe, a bride's family might request special compensation if the groom had acted disrespectfully or if he had harmed a family member. The requirement of compensation ensured that respect and propriety were maintained throughout the process, fostering a sense of mutual accountability. However, this transactional nature sometimes led to complex power dynamics, where women were bound to their husbands' families with limited agency to dissolve the marriage, especially if the marriage brought material gain. Conclusion: a complex cultural tapestry of intimacy and relationships. Through the diverse customs and social norms of Native American tribes, we see that intimacy, marriage and relationships held deeply nuanced roles. Far from being merely private affairs, they were vehicles of spiritual expression, communal stability, and even social justice. The severe penalties for violating these norms reflect the immense value that tribes placed on honor and respect, not only between partners, but among extended families and the community at large. These tribal practices reveal both contrasts and surprising parallels with other world cultures, highlighting universal themes of loyalty, gender roles, and community cohesion. The intimate connections formed in these tribes often carried more weight than simple affection, embodying the beliefs and values that shaped each tribe's identity. In a world where survival depended on unity and respect, intimacy among Native American tribes was as much about personal relationships as it was about the survival of the community.